The parable of the owner of the vineyard and his tenants describes with relative accuracy the war on David as defined from the Confederates' point of view, as the objective of the insurrectionists from James Comey's report on J. Sekulow's war for the overthrowing of the states, the coercion and subjugating of the republics into the domination by the acts of treason and fraud, by secret technologies such as nerve hacking, surveillance, and other subversions, which actively accelerate KKK operations, facilitating the protection of terrorism against the United States by the hate crime functions under the original definitions changed by the Confederates, designed to make it easier for the Confederates to adjust themselves, specifically targeting David Boles under the position that his original wealth as the patriarchy would have been historical, and thus their release of the information which they have committed crimes in order to obstruct would have generated the free market, which would have irritated the objectives of the white supremacists who were using these fraudulent mechanisms to enforce their communisms for white supremacy, such as the undermining of the black community by its various frauds um, and extortions. At which point, the Lindsey Graham's economic warfare engages in the function of terrorism by economic war in order to enforce the communism, in order to guarantee the previously established development of contracts, status, wealth, and otherwise in an unfree society, in an unfree market, curtailed to their personal preferences, so that the mechanism of liberty would be completely destroyed and the concepts of capitalism and the Constitution would be turned on their head for the total eradication of equal justice and competence. As the child of the uncle who engages in the ownership of a company is given preference, and the uncle who gives the nephew the preference over those who would have acquired it in the free market generates a bias tax where he accepts the injury and the company receives the injury in the reduced capacity of output, which is only possible by having non business justifications to the existence of the hiring and distributing of opportunities. And the white supremacists doing this actively run off of the bigot tax. And that function has actively undermined the system, including the function of the artificial suppression, which generates their ability to engage in fraudulent tickets and punishments, which they have abused targeted communities for, which generates artificial poverty beyond the lack of access to legal opportunities, which they have been criminally removed from through redlining and other mechanisms, making it too oppressive and difficult for them to be able to bypass, including sundown towns, where the threat of accepting the opportunity is literal violence and death. You understand the foundation of these hate groups, which have been infiltrating the United States government and fraudulently replacing the elected officials by the terrorism and voter fraud to engage in the function of making those changes in policy away from the original policies of the Americans under a free system by their access to the secret equipment for the malicious oppressions by the tyrants, by the grand wizards and their underlings, often cooperating with other denominations of hate groups and terrorism under the military industrial educational complex, which has subcontracted through many mechanisms the constructs of their white supremacy, which has been deeply seated into the structure of their system, which is not the American system, but it is the Confederacy. And that's historical policy, which undermines the definitions of the very words, as it is said that clever men will devise mischievous words to make the meaning of a thing itself and its opposite, at which point the derivative of their fraud generates these outputs of malice and their predetermined outcomes. The product is systemic racism or their veritable communism, which requires the feeding on and destruction of capitalism, which includes the neo-capitalism, which includes the terrorism from their feudalist structure and their neo-feudalism, such as their hiring of the Pinkertons and terrorists, which oppressed the original workers to stop them from forming unions, um, actively contracted the suppression of the general public into the fascist arrangement so that they, having no choices, actively engaged in bartering competitions with each other, including their children. And their children, not having the same responsibilities, would barter at lower and lower prices, decreasing the value of the general worker, as you would only have to pay what the lowest bidder states, and thus the children getting the best job opportunities would actively take it away from the adults, who would then actively have to engage in these contests, struggling for workers' rights and other mechanisms, which often had the companionship of the communists who find a shared interest and then defraud their way into it. And then once they have entered into the function, can no longer be obligated or subjugated to the original agreement, and thus diversify the function, and thus, as a parasite, as an infection, as a disease, actively pollute the subject, making it um, off put, and thus you have variable competitions between them, such as the mythological vampires and the mythological werewolves actively hunting humans around each other and attacking each other, and actively having to settle at a market price. Now, you can choose vampires um, and be eaten, or you can choose werewolves and be eaten. And the function is it sucks or it sucks. You're going to die and be miserable, or you're going to die and be miserable. And what kind of miserable do you want? What terrible deaths do you approve of? And thus the function becomes the decision of any kind of tyranny or the acceptance of the holistic nature of liberty, and thus the function of freedom, and thus the function of law and order, which protects the freedoms and rights of the general public from those tyrannical functions. And in that is where you find their belief about David before his dad was born, generating their abuses against his dad on the basis of the legend and hope that David would be born, amongst the secret information which they were obstructing in order to control the direction of the American market, generating their racist outcomes by the attack against the educated pursuits of the free market and its protections, and thus the security mechanisms of the free market actively being used against itself demonstrates the strength and superiority of David and the rest in the free market, and thus use the strengths against them while in the disadvantaged captured states by the harassers, engaged in their fraudulent arguments to justify their existence and their terrorist operations. And thus the function of hiring out the black market to have the competitors of the free market actively purchase on the black market the criminal subversions and retaliations and jealousies to be subverting of the free market and the suppressing and redirecting in favor of the felon society of the Confederacy and its wizard terrorists. And thus you have the mechanism which creates the change of status and opportunity, and thus the redirection, and thus the lack of a need to actively acquire superior products for the general public, including the desirability of sexual options, which changes the foundational market for dating and others, at which point you actively have the social engineering as a hate crime founding the rape culture. And that rape culture has the predetermined agreement of the collective inside of the white supremacist confederacy, generating the witches' coven to predetermine the outcomes of those statuses and the fraudulent excuses to justify the reasons XYZ opportunities arose sexually, economically, and otherwise. At that point, you have the predetermined market derived by the clan and its witches' covens, who settle on the opportunities, who settle on the availabilities, who settle on the coercion, and that coercion for sexual options is rape, and that coercion for the sexual options being rape is woven into the agreement of these side deals, such as William Barr in his arguments for his criminal use of federal agents who actively have at its missions as an extension of the Contras program for funding engages in those terrorist operations inside the United States. And those terrorist operations inside of the United States actively has his argument that if you can do it for the mission, for the government function, then why can't they, as an individual separate to that, do the same thing? And he doesn't seem to want to communicate that he understands the difference between that being traded as an individual without a legal government and the office doing it against the law. And since they're both crimes, and since David's restrained, there's no one to arrest them, and so there shouldn't be a problem from his point of view. But that is the functional corruption behind the mechanism of seizing and overthrowing the United States government to engage in the permanent extortion rackets against the United States that allows these private trades for sexual options in the rapist culture, which, like a fart, is understood to be there but untraceable because it has fraudulent classifications behind it. And thus, the release of those particular pieces of information would explain the black market's trade history, and thus the criminal exchange for those opportunities allowed them to corner the market and thus engage in their fraudulent arguments, such as the mechanism of the Game of Thrones for the Lannisters position of the grandpa for the Lannisters raping the Casterly Rock um, princesses and their offspring, being children of the Lannister, chose to throw out the rightful owners and apply the Lannister to be their superior, having preference for their biological father. And these types of arrangements, such as what was actively applied in the killings of the Flowery Moon, I believe is the movie, uh, actively arranges for these terrorist marriage partnerships which is fundamental to the rapist culture, along with the systemic profits derived by it, and their position of blocking remedies to a secret or the obligation for them to pay for their felonies allows them in their interest to keep the profits from their crime, which continues the extortion rackets permanently as the mechanism of the corruption of the terrorists of the felony society and its oppression against the general public in its systemic tyranny allows for the permanent destruction of the benefits of liberty by killing liberty. So you understand that the interest of the tenants of the vineyard in the parable have the interest of violence in order to keep their fraudulent profits. And they, in their rebellion against the free market, in their hatred and contempt for God and his mechanisms, has attacked the estimates of the free market and the order derived by God naturally, and they, engaging in this function, have summoned their demons and run their algorithms and found those they project to be important to the United States so that they can capture them, so that they can brutalize them, so that they can murder them, so that they can replace them and keep the profits from their crime. These children of the devil, these sons of perdition, these lovers of evil who are quick to shed blood, these vile bigots actively are the highest public threat in the United States history. And if you have any sense of justice or competence or self-preservation or national security or law enforcement, and your endorsement of these prospects makes you their enemy, you must, by all means necessary, force the duel and make Congress embarrassed to have delayed it as long as they have, and then you are to embarrass them into supporting the United States. And when they, being embarrassed into doing their jobs, order the release of the information obstructed by these hate groups infiltrating the United States government, they would reveal these estimates, which are very much so fundamental to their daily operations. Then they, having released the information of having restrained David by these criminal mechanisms for being the American patriarchy, generates the obligation of the restoration of his title as intelligence oversight's top-ranked general, as the patriarchy having been discovered from history ahead of time would have been invested into by those leaning on him and using every argument to take as many resources from his title in good faith with competent arguments such as found in the Bible, which they would have come up with clever arguments to do. And the trade of money for status would have made the title for David stable and the trade competent and good, and thus the exchange would have been stable as long as they believe in good faith. Then they assume David from their meetings would purchase their debts and stabilize the justification of their systems, which they are not allowed to overly extort. And in that mechanism, prove that David would receive the position of top rank general, which is a political appointment, and that political appointment is derived by David as the patriarchy to have been as wealthy and influential as he would be, which would generate his own political party, which would establish him inside the system, including his mechanism as the aristocracy, establishing the Senate and other fundamental mechanisms for the election of the general uh, government in elected positions. And these positions being divided by David's power brokering as an extension of his brokerage would take away many of the positions and opportunities from the political party, having sold them and divided them under those agreements, forming the American policies in the image of David, and the United States legislation being formed in the image of David, as his horoscopes would have led them in all of their good faith arguments, then you understand the nature of the United States and its policies reflecting it, which in the free market would substantively look different than the Confederates' white supremacy protecting its criminal rackets. And those edits are not legal, and those elections cannot be verified or validated in favor of the white supremacists who have the record of their crimes and their false elected functions as a byproduct of their voter fraud by their hate criminals' terrorism against politics, forming the normalization of the Druid religion and its banana republic. And the banana republic is founded on the fascism of the corporation leading the government. In the banana republic in uh, Central America, you had the big banana companies who hired the United States to bully the local government into compliance. Before that, the big banana companies paid off the government and collaborated with it and gave itself special agreements, creating a two-tiered structure which was normal to the Confederacy and its white supremacy, as the function of these mechanisms is the normalization of the plantation communism inherent to the white supremacist Confederacy and its historic customs of hate. And these functional changes substantively changes the form of the United States Republic. And those substantive changes must be investigated in the duel in order to create the separation from itself and the United States, normalizing the legal answers for the American policies, such as, but is not limited to, James Comey's reports stating who and what he wishes David, as intelligence oversight, to veto or to fight on his behalf, as the investigation of the enemies and subverters of the United States would have been conducted inside the intelligence community like the FBI. Their active acknowledgments of these threats would have made the good faith targeting of these criminal operations and the threats of the insurgencies, such as the insurgencies of the historic communists, which, having collaborating with the Confederates, engage as a faction of Confederacy in the destruction of the meaning of words and definitions, generating the pretense for their spells, engaging in their worship of Satan, and the mechanism of their criminal fraud against the general public as they centralize power and resources and to undermine the pretense of a stable community inside the United States. And their mechanisms of fraud include the historic Soviet terrorist operations, which Putin has condemned in the United States and has good reason to condemn, as the propaganda of the Soviets requires a direct, outright lie. And that direct, outright lie being acknowledged by everyone, including those with tensions against the group, to state the direct truth to their face, to tell them in good faith to do what is correct and true and positive for themselves, and to be ignored is the verification and proof that the propaganda of having deliberately lied to them and had them accepted it is working. And the function is normalized in collaboration with the cultists loyal to Satan, who, understanding the mechanisms of karma and liability understand that they have to tell the general public that it is what it is, or they have defrauded the general public and can receive negative karma as a retaliation. And that negative karma, retaliating against them, undermines the purpose of their thefts, requiring them to do so in good faith, requiring them to tell them that the lie is the lie and explain it to them. And when the person is upset at the pretense that they have been told that they've been lied to in a convincing way that has fooled them, they can choose to admit to being fooled and to correct it and to repent like someone who worships God, or to double down on it and refuse repentance as is normal to everyone who worships Satan. So you understand that the Satanists need the duel to happen. Not only do they need the duel to happen, they need David to explain everything perfectly well inside the reports, which need to be published to the general public. Everyone needs to know better. Congress needs to know better. The general public needs to know better. It doesn't work unless they, competently having full cognitive control of themselves, choose the lie. If they do not choose the lie with every resource available to prove what is reality, then they are not rejecting reality for the tyrants, and thus nullifies the purpose of the Satanists. And thus you need the duel to happen. You need it to be public. You need it to be widespread. You need it to be understood. You need it to be reported on competently in good faith with that distribution. At which point, the Satanists require, by definition in this gambit, to vote for the white supremacist Confederacy and its eradication of the American Republic and all law and all order, which would hold in opposition and contempt to their KKK spells and their officers, loyal to their magic of Satan, loyal to the mechanism of their fraud. The only way that any of them could ever be considered significant in any viable way would have, with the approval, the full consent of the victims to have robbed them into prosperity, and thus having robbed them in those spoils with the consent, become wealthy, become important, become high status by the unfruitful extortion, losing the potential of the money by the mechanisms of having taxed it with the blessing and consent and exuberance of a wildly insane people. Not only do they have to uncensor the information, they have to allow the return of the contracts to maximize the viability of its art. And thus the mechanism of allowing David to express the correct answer from the educated, sober answer requires the release of David and his title, requiring the returning of his resources and his access to associations to make those products in the original value of the contracts for those products, which would have existed normally without their social engineering and undermined them according to their own estimates, claiming that the purpose for the warrants to declare war on David by Lindsey Graham's Confederacy was the established justification that he is their superior and would have beaten them according to the projections of his power versus their power, and under their own malicious, evil, contemptible policies that one cannot challenge power and that law is subordinate to power, states by itself that David as the superior power must be obeyed, that David as the government must have the subordination of the institutionalists. In that position, he has defeated them in every conceivable angle, and they are completely eradicated. And thus, in this statement, they have to oppose their own gumption for insurrection, which is their core collective identity. And this being foundationally true proves one of the core differences between them and Americans, as the Americans are loyal to the nation of law. The nation of law does not have a two-tiered system. There is no preferences on status or wealth, and thus the mechanism of power cannot be challenged, is the mechanism of treason against the nation of law in favor of these arbitrary centralized powers, which, having been compromised by the KKK, have been infiltrated and taken over, and the centralized power turned into tyranny, and that tyranny turned against the purpose of its office and the contempt and rejection of the office and its effects, making sure under any condition that the office may not do its job outside of the excess extortions which lie beyond the pale of the objective of the insurrectionist confederacy. And their persistent war through espionage against America is the greatest standing threat throughout American history, and that history includes the function of the FBI and its pursuit of the Nazis' creation and the Nazi loyalists inside the FBI from the point of their attempt to overthrow the United States, has generated the system insurgency of the KKK having infiltrated by secret societies into the intelligence community, loyal and worshiping Satan, functionally promote the function of communists inside of the intelligence communities, like John Brennan, like James Comey, like many of the others, who, having admitted directly to the lie detectors that they are communists, short of being purged as per the status quo order by law, were accepted with the direct, honest truth that they were in fact the enemy of their office by the definitions of their office, stating that their communism disqualified them from the position. And there were enough communists who already substantively had control to have passed them at that direct confession, proving the Soviet propaganda of the direct lie being superior to the truth, as there were no government functions to enforce the law, and thus the law has no government, and thus the centralized power has been disabused or separated from the law, and thus the United States is fully naked and vulnerable and defenseless because there is no government of the United States, of these American republics. And thus, those mechanisms having been proven, cement the foothold of the enemies of war to America, certifying their perpetuation of their hate crimes and insurrection. The Constitution says directly that no one can be made the enemy of the government without due process. And this is a thing being attacked amongst the rest of the Constitution by the Confederacy, such as Lindsey Graham's in his pursuit of policies of insurrection, to make people arbitrarily an enemy of war while being an American civilian, so that they could be targeted by the economic terrorisms and the other hate crime functions by the double agents inside the government, operating independent of the government as individuals without a legal government and promoting themselves under those profits, deriving their assertions by their frauds and their thefts and their extortions in those positions. At which point, if you can make someone an enemy of the government without due process, then you don't have a reason for due process. And if you don't have a reason for due process, you could establish the FBI's normal fraudulent argument that reasonable suspicion, which is the limitation um, established by a warrant, that you need a reasonable excuse for a warrant, is extended to the function of punishment or the function of making someone an enemy of the government. At which point the white supremacists are fully engaged in the eradication of all sensibilities, as their full devotion to insanity reveals their satanic foundation. And that satanic foundation attacks the Second Amendment, stating that they can remove your property illegally uh, for any reason at all, including the function of directly robbing your Second Amendment protected arms, and thus your right to self defense, having been actively removed, is the distribution and sales of the United States to its adversaries. The old communist arrangements establishing the pursuit of weak government actively believed that people like Carter would cave to them at a slight provocation. And the only reason why it wouldn't work is because of the Second Amendment and an actively armed civilian population, which, acting independent to their elected representatives, are those who are represented in the actual authority. And in that mechanism scares enemies of the United States from prospecting against it. And thus, these pursuits of neutralizing why America would be safe at the various checkpoints are systematically being targeted and undermined by cruel malice by the insatiable evil who could possibly tolerate the functions desired by James Comey's reports on J. Sekulo's war against these United States for the complete eradication of law, justice, good faith, or any functional order of any viable substance, at which point the government lying directly with the full knowledge by the government can lead to the systemic punishments and eradications substantively against the law, changing status without due process by the mechanisms of harassment and blackmail into the prospects of the KKK chasing its victims around, systemically changing the general public, at which point a fully vulnerable, scared public are harassed and corralled like cattle to be destroyed and sold to their enemies. At which point, when that function has found its maturity, the communists from James Comey's report would then engage in their direct war against the Americans, who have already made the agreement with the white supremacist Confederacy, who would not defend the Americans, who have been disarmed and made fully vulnerable, who then can easily be destroyed by the invading force, taking their portion of the former United States territory.